Welcome to Season 3 of Adapt, Climate Change and the Built Environment, where we interview professionals across the private and public sectors to discuss adapting the built environment to a changing climate. We believe that ensuring climate adaptation to extreme weather and evolving climate patterns needs us to re-examine what it takes to make our buildings, infrastructure, and communities resilient and adaptable so that our society can continue to thrive for years and decades to come. And with that, let's get started.
Hi, Monika.
Hello, Jessica.
Today we talked to Boyce Upholt, a writer and nature critic whose writing has won a James Beard Award for investigative journalism and has appeared in The Atlantic, National Geographic, the Oxford American, Virginia Quarterly Review, and other publications. His first book, which I am now obsessed with, is called The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi, which won the Willie Morris Award for Southern Writing. And again, we'll talk about this, but I think it's so wild that it won an award for Southern Writing. As most people who know me know this, I grew up just north of the headwaters of the Mississippi River. So, both because of my physical location and of course because the official headwaters of the Mississippi are in Minnesota. I think most Minnesotans have a very strong connection to the Mississippi River. But in listening to Boyce and in reading his book, I also realized there's this completely different Mississippi River, the lower Mississippi, that really I don't know at all and is a completely different body of water. And so that was part of why I found this conversation so fascinating.
Yeah, the book is both a love letter to nature and a warning of what happens when we think we can't control nature. We mentioned our love for nature in this episode, but I wanted to highlight that you don't need to be a tree hugger to love this book and to love this episode. I think it's just an understanding of our dependence on nature, and nature will keep going. Mother Nature will be fine after the effects of climate change affect the earth. It is a matter of what happens to us, people, the communities. As we keep seeing, nature can be so dangerous and powerful. And the Mississippi River has repeatedly taught us over and over that we need to respect it and we can't always control nature.
Yeah, there's so many lessons to be learned from the Mississippi and what we've tried to do with the Mississippi. And it actually ties into something I read about as I was reading about the next book I want to read, which is called Sea of Grass, The Conquest, Ruin, and Redemption of Nature on the American Prairie, which is a book by Minnesotans. But they said a line in there, and they were actually talking about farming in the prairie, but I'm like, this applies to the Mississippi River. This applies to everything. This line has stuck with me ever since I read it. Nature does not like simplicity. Nature likes complexity. And that makes me think of how when we do approach climate change or even just nature generally, we have tried to be very simplistic, right? We have a river. We're going to put it in channels and we're going to put, levees up, kind of borders around it, and we're just going to control it nicely. Yeah, nature does not like that. More specifically, too, as I was doing a deep dive post our talk with Boyce into all things Mississippi River, I actually did have to look up what's happening in Winona. I mentioned in the podcast sitting at the locks and dams outside of Winona, watching barges go through the Mississippi. And of course, Winona is low enough on the Mississippi, Minnesota, that it has levees. But it's funny, I was actually just reading that just this summer, they're trying to find more funding, which they do not have yet, to actually build up the levee system in part of Winona. What's wild about this is a levee that was built just in the 90s, and it's already outdated and needs improvement. So again, shows how quickly our climate is changing. And even though the people involved with the levee system say there's no risk of flooding, I thought this was interesting too, that because it's no longer certified, because it's outdated, it could actually lead to property owners having to pay for expensive flood insurance because of the impact on the FEMA flood maps. So again, having to pay more for flood insurance is obviously far less of a tragedy than actually like losing lives or communities is. But still, it just shows how there are so many impacts from not seriously dealing with these rivers and the potential for flooding thanks to climate change.
I love that nature being complex because nature is perfectly complex. We touched briefly on this in the interview, but there's some farmers who are recognizing that riverside farming has become more risky on low-lying farms. So they want to turn over some of that land to give the river room to spread out so that future floods are not as devastating.
Yeah, and we'll include a link to that article in the show notes too. And again, I do think, people are starting to have a little bit more appreciation for the danger of flooding, at least for those who are right next to rivers that tend to flood, like the Mississippi or the Red River up in Minnesota and North Dakota. But I was also just reading an article that, again, we'll include in the show notes about how we generally don't understand or take seriously as Americans our flood risks. Now, I did live in Texas for many years, and flash flood warnings were always a concern down there. But again, that was more of a thought of for individuals maybe trying to cross a low river or people out fishing or tubing in the river. I never imagined the kind of tragedy that we just saw this summer in the Texas Hill Country. And obviously, the worry is that this is going to get worse. We're seeing this all over. The fact that, again, a hurricane can, cause deadly inland flooding in North Carolina is a sort of new lesson we're having to learn. So if we don't start taking these flood risks more seriously, we're going to keep seeing more tragedies, which is something none of us want.
Jessica, we talked about this all the time. Climate change is making natural disasters more intense, more repetitive, and they're lasting longer. And this is why adaptation is so important. This is why we bring you experts in many topics that relate to adaptation so that we figure this out together. We do not have all the answers. But as we talked with Boyce, we can't adapt to climate change by controlling nature. It's a complex issue, but we certainly can look to the past to learn from our mistakes and do better going forward because we have to do better. And now let's get to our great conversation with Boyce.
Boyce, thank you so much for joining Monika and me today. We are so excited to have you here. I am very excited to have you here because of my close personal relationship to the Mississippi River. But before I gush on about you and the book too much, we are here to talk about your book, The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. Can you tell us what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully I don't go too long, but I often begin the story as a kid. I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how to do that. And I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, so nowhere near the Mississippi River. And then in trying to figure out how to be a writer, kind of wandered around the country and found myself taking a job in rural Mississippi in a place called the Mississippi Delta, right? So it's named for the Mississippi River. The soils there are literally built by the river. And that place is very strange and funky and American and haunted. And it appears prominently in the book. And I was so fascinated with it that it kind of forced me to start writing about it. But I didn't write about the river at first, right? And so it took a couple of years of being there. Eventually, I was assigned a profile of a river guide named John Rusky, who is sort of this legendary figure there. I knew who, like, everybody in the Mississippi Delta knows who he is. And I was like, it'd be fun to go out on the Mississippi River with this guy, even though I don't know anything about that river. So I spent 3 days and 2 nights with John, and that canoe trip changed my life, really. I was out there, and I was like, it was so incredibly gorgeous, the river was. And that was such a surprise to me. I think I had a notion in my head that the Mississippi must just be a big toxic engineered canal. And so I just got obsessed. I kept wanting to go back there and I kept wanting to learn more and more, first about that space right there. We call it the Batcher. And then eventually wanted to learn kind of the whole of the watershed and how we've treated it. And so that's what led to this book.
Wow, that's fantastic. It really inspires us when we see something that it just impacts us and we become obsessed about it, right?
Yes.
Your book covers so much history and science. How long did it take you to write the book?
Also a good question. It's and complicated one to answer. So the first time I went on that river, that trip I just described was back in 2015, so 10 years ago this year. And within a couple weeks of that, I had turned in the assignment that I had about this canoe guide, John Rusky. And some pieces of that very first story live on in this book. So parts of it were written 10 years ago. In 2017, I knew by then that this obsession was going to lead to a book. I didn't know what the book would look like. But in 2017, I canoed from St. Louis to the Gulf of Mexico and did a lot of writing along the way. A lot of that writing lives on in the book. And then officially sold the book to W.W. Norton in 2020. And so it took 4 years in the end, but from like getting a green light from a publisher saying, yes, we're going to do this, it was 4 years. And that's when I really had to go deep in all these different subjects. But fortunately by then, yeah, I was 5 years into my obsession and had already kind of went into a lot of rabbit holes and had some knowledge at that point.
A lot of knowledge. I mean, just so the audience knows, this will be my first gushing recommendation. Talks about the geology and the ice ages and the formation of the Mississippi Delta. There's also so much history there you touch on the indigenous people who lived there, to the extent we still can kind of have records of, much earlier cultures before there was the colonization of the U.S. Obviously, there's all kinds of discussions in there that bring to mind still racial inequity things that we're still addressing today. just all sorts of nature and geology things too, which I mean, I was like, I wish I was a water expert reading your book. There are parts of it I think I need to read a few times. So the depth of knowledge and all the different parts you bring to this are just really, it's a very impressive feat. For today, we're going to try to focus more on that part of the book that really intersects with what we talk about, which is climate adaptation in the built environment. So we'll talk a lot about that. But before we do talk about that, and again, bringing up the fact that I'm from Minnesota, and it seems like most of the time when people think of the Mississippi, every Minnesotan thinks of it in Minnesota. Everybody else thinks of New Orleans and maybe the lower Mississippi. You do spend time talking about Minnesota, spend time talking about some of the other areas up here where there's national wildlife refuges. But otherwise, a lot of the focus is on the lower Mississippi, which I want to make sure I'm getting that definition right. The lower Mississippi is what you call it once the Ohio has joined, right? Is everything south of that?
Yes. Yeah. So the Ohio River, basically the Mississippi River, in my mind, is made up of three big tributaries. They're made up of 100,000 named waterways, but they come into the three big tributaries, which are the Missouri, the Ohio, and the upper Mississippi, right? And the Ohio is important because half of the water that we get down here in New Orleans comes out of the Ohio River. So when you look at sort of the water flow maps, you're like, oh, wow, the Mississippi River is really the Ohio River in many ways. So that's the definition. It begins in Cairo, Illinois. So the very, very bottom tip of Illinois, that's where the Ohio and the Mississippi come together. And it's about 1,100 miles from there to the Gulf of Mexico. And yeah, I mean, I think embedded in your question is sort of why focus on the lower Mississippi. And I think some of it is the bias, right? Like I discovered the Mississippi River in Mississippi and Louisiana. I've spent the past 16 years living alongside the Mississippi River down here in the South. It's actually 2 blocks behind me from where I sit right now. And so it's the river I know best. I can't take that out of it, but I also think that like when you think about what makes the river special, there are so many things. There's that sort of its role in American history. There's the fact that the north to south true named Mississippi is this important flyaway for birds. But ultimately, what sets this river apart from other rivers is its size and its scale, and those 100,000 named waterways that I talked about, and the million square miles of water that drain in here. And so to me, it's here in the lower Mississippi River, once all three big tributaries have joined together, that it sort of assembles its true character and its true force. And so you can understand the other rivers separately and differently, and it was important to me to study all three of those, but really, when we think of the might of the Mississippi River, it's down here where we get just this incredible amount of water flowing past.
One line from your book that really stuck with us was one that says, the story of a river is always the story of its floodplain, or it should be. In light of what just happened, the tragedy that just happened in Texas on the Guadalupe River, could you tell us more about what you mean by that line? Is it like, it's so powerful and dangerous, right? And it's so impactful. Is that what you mean? Or are you telling us that there's more to the floodplain than just the danger of flooding?
There's definitely more to the floodplain than just the danger of flooding. I mean, I think these things are intertwined to me, right? When I say the story of the river should be the story of the floodplain, it's in part that I think that when we look at maps and we see rivers kind of represented and delineated of here's a line and here's some blue and here's a line and that's where the river is, that doesn't match the reality of rivers, or at least I can speak again to the Mississippi and the lower Mississippi River in particular. It doesn't do that. It moves, it changes. It can, in a single year down here in the South, the Mississippi River can rise and fall 60 feet, right? And so if you pull up Google Maps and you see an island, it might be there sometimes, but if the river rises, it might disappear. These maps that are on the cover of my book, the Fisk maps, are these very famous maps that depict the way that the river has really changed over thousands and thousands of years. And so the floodplain is part of that change, right? The floodplain is the area that when the river is reaching its highest water levels gets covered in water. And so even though it's only wet for part of the year, I think it's a mistake to sort of subtract that from the river and think, well, it's not essential, right? It is really essential to the ecosystems. That's where baby fish grow up. It is really essential to also the flow of water. It's essential to processing nutrients because those wetlands can help take things like nitrogen and sort of put them into plants and keep them from reaching the oceans. And so it's just the beating heart of the river in many ways. I've got some friends who talk about it as the kidneys. And so when you recognize the importance of the floodplain, I think you can make decisions and say, oh, maybe we shouldn't put cabins in a floodplain. That's an unfortunate component of this tragedy. I think more and more information is coming out of sort of what went wrong here. And part of it, I do think, was sort of a misassessment of risk. And so we need to recognize you can never fully take away a floodplain. But interesting, like the Mississippi Delta where I used to live, it's one giant floodplain that is 90 miles across if you include the Arkansas side across the river. Right? And those places, we are pretty safe to build now because we've built these levees, but I still think we should think of them as part of the story of the river because they used to be connected to the river, and the river is going to act differently without them. And the floodplains, when they're not sort of raging with floods, are really beautiful, productive, life-giving places as well. So that's kind of what I mean there.
Yeah, that's a great explanation because in the built environment world, we think of floodplain as something that is not as fluid, right? Like this block is going to flood at, in 100-year flood, or it will not, which I'm sure we can have a whole podcast episode on just floodplains. But thank you for that explanation. And 60 feet, that's crazy.
It is. It's insane.
Can you tell us about the Batture? Is that how you pronounce it?
Batture. You just got to get your
Okay.
southern accent out there.
Okay. Can you tell us about the Batture? You talk about how productive it is, but I had never heard of that term before. What is it? And why is that important?
So the batture, and the way you're saying it, batture, is like it's from French, right? And it means like basically to batter. That's the derivative word. And so the batture is the land between the levees, essentially. So to go back to that derivation, it's kind of like the flood battered land. It's the places we've built a levee to try and keep the floods intact, but there's a little bit of land left that is going to get flooded every year. And part of the reason why you might haven't heard of that is it's kind of a weird, distinctively Southern word, a Louisiana word that came out of the French heritage here to describe that on the Mississippi River, because our batture is much bigger than any other river. And it's also a completely man-made thing, right? You can't have a batture without a levee. It's kind of saying the floodplain that's left inside the levee. And so it's a funny thing that way. But it is, in terms of that productivity, it's as productive as the old floodplain used to be, right? It's because the floods continue to touch the batture, it still gets loads of sediment that are carried downriver, these very rich river-carried sediments that are the thing that made the Mississippi Delta such productive farmland. And so it remains sort of this wild, feral wetland where you get all kinds of trees and you get all kinds of wildlife, perhaps even more so because so much of the floodplain that wildlife can't access anymore because it's become inhabited. So all of the bears and the coyotes and deers are out there living in the batture. And that's kind of what attracted me to the river in the first place, was finding this sort of secret lost world on the far side of the levees that I got to explore.
That sounds amazing. And yeah, I did not know what that term was. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, okay, before we get into the levees and the man-made efforts to control the Mississippi, I do want to talk a little bit more about meanders. Just that way everybody kind of understands. I think a lot of us, we picture pretty little rivers, little trickling brooks or something like that, like very pretty, but you're like, there's a riverbank. Like, here's where the river is and always has been, right? I should also note, with a caveat, of course, that we spoke in our last season to Ben Goldfarb, who I believe you know.
Yes.
Wrote a great book about beavers. And of course, beavers, especially before, again, Europeans arrived, did a good job of actually changing a lot of the water in our entire nation, just as they continued to build dams, and then there'd be buildups behind that, and they moved around. But I think one of the things that really hit home in reading your book was how alive rivers are and how they also change over time. I mean, you can go look, assuming like there's no human intervention, you could go look at a river and say, here's where the river goes now. In a decade, it could be totally different, right? I mean, so that is a common, I guess, is that a hydrologic feature, a geologic feature of rivers, that they tend to go all over?
Both, I guess, right? Like hydrology and geology are really intertwined in rivers because rivers are water, but they're also mud. So they're water and geology at once. But you want me to explain what a meander is and how it works?
Yeah, just a little bit about that, just so everyone understands, because I think it would help to understand that when we then talk about what we tried to do with the Mississippi.
So yeah, meander is a fancy word for a river bend, but more than that, meander is typically sort of, think of it as a noun and a verb at once, right? Because the meanders are always changing. And so part of this is the lower Mississippi River. It kind of has built the land that it flows through. There used to be this big trough at the bottom of the continent, got filled up with mud, and it's pretty flat, right? So it's not the kind of landscape that the river is just going to run in a straight line, seeking its way quickly to the ocean. It's too flat for that. So it's kind of slowly winding, and that's the beginning of the meanders. But what happens is, once you got this river flowing, just the physics of a river bend, right? Water is going to have to move faster on the outside of a river bend than on the inside, so that it can all kind of move that distance in the same time period. And that faster water is more erosive. And so on the outside of the bend, it's actually going to start carving away at that riverbank. The slower water is going to do the opposite because it's moving so slowly. Some of this mud that's in the Big Muddy, as we often call the Mississippi, the Missouri, all these rivers, but it's dropping some of that mud on the inside of the bend because it's moving slowly. And those two things combined mean the bend is going to always get wider and wider and wider because the inside is growing, the outside is pushing outward. And eventually those bends get so wide that they take on this horseshoe shape. And then that horseshoe is going to come so close that you're going to get a flood and the river is going to realize, why am I wasting my time going around this big wide curve? I could just jump through the sort of neck of this horseshoe. And so that whole meander, it's called, gets cut off. It turns into an oxbow lake, right? All these crazy terms we have. And so, yeah, again, the cover of the book, if people want to look it up, it is these Fisk maps that I mentioned, shows these meanders and shows how through this process, the river has kind of always fluctuated back and forth across the floodplain. So you can stand on the soils alongside the Mississippi River, and you're probably standing where the river used to run because of the way it behaves.
Thank you for that. Didn't mean to put you on the spot for science education, but I think it really does help. That and the visuals of the Fisk maps. I will tell people if they're interested, you can get Fisk maps off of Etsy. So I ordered a portion of something. And I think it was done by a U.S. hired geologist, I think in the 40s, right, to map the various meanders that the Mississippi had taken.
Yes, it was done by a man named Harold Fisk, who it's named for, and this was in the 1940s. He was hired by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which I don't typically associate with as being sort of an agency that produces documents like this. It's like a stunning map, and they're actually in the public domain, so you can print them out yourself if you can find the high-quality versions in the archives. But yeah, one of the amazing things to me, though, is in 1940, when Fisk made these maps, the Army Corps asked him to do so. The Army Corps had been working for a century to engineer the Mississippi River at that point. It's the first time that they were like, hey, we should probably figure out what it used to do. You know, that might be helpful knowledge, which is an indication of why it's surprising that the Army Corps is the one that sort of paid for and created these beautiful documents that emphasize just how wild the Mississippi is.
All right. It really is. Yeah. I cannot emphasize enough. We'll put a link to some Fisk maps just so people can see. But that does segue nicely to then, yes, there have been lots of efforts. And again, we won't go through all of them, but you detail in your book all sorts of efforts, some of them just kind of by entrepreneurial people, right, to find a way to basically make the Mississippi more business transportation friendly, ways to cut through some of these meander shortcuts. So we won't get into all that. I think our focus will be on the Army Corps of Engineers and the locks and dams because of the size of that. It is funny, again, one more personal note, I also spent some time living down in Winona, Minnesota, which again is right on the Mississippi shortly before it leaves Minnesota. And we would literally go sit at one of the locks and watch like the barges and the various boats go through the dams, because this is before smartphones. There wasn't that much to do. And of course, at the time, I did not realize that one little lock that I was sitting at was part of this major civil infrastructure project. The levees and the locks and dams that we're going to be talking were all spearheaded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, right?
Yes, yeah. So they're this, basically think of them as a giant federal construction firm, especially when it comes to rivers and waterways. If you're building something on a big river, it's going to be the Army Corps doing it.
And so according to you, and again, because the Mississippi has been used so much, obviously, and we'll talk about why this is done financially and all of that, but the locks, dams, and the levees that we see along the Mississippi, and of course also the tributaries, which would be the Missouri and the Ohio, and possibly some of the smaller rivers as well.
Yeah, the Red, the Arkansas have some. Actually, it's a long list. Even some pretty small rivers have locks and dams at this point too. But
okay, yeah.
So,
but that whole project is actually the largest river channelization project in the world. And you would argue that it's the most successful civil works project ever initiated by Congress. So I'm going to ask you a simple question, but I expect this is going to be a long answer. Why was this done? How has it worked? And how successful has it been?
Yeah, it could be a long answer. Let me see. Wait, I'm going to jot that down now. Wait, why was it done? And then was the second part of it?
But, what was done, why, and yeah, how well has it worked?
Okay, got it. Yeah. So, we'll levees briefly. There's two kinds of work, if we want to simplify it, right? There's two things that, in what I call the American years, we wanted rivers to do, or two ways we said, we don't like what rivers are doing in their natural state. And so one of those was we looked at the floodplain and said that it's wet sometimes, but we'd like it to be dry all the time. And that's why we built levees, to turn it into farms. In terms of the locks and dams, we kind of looked at rivers and said, well, these are obviously very effective networks for traveling the country, this big continent we have, right? And that was particularly true in the first of the American years. After the American Revolution, roads in this country were not very good. And so even a sort of wild rapids and rapids-filled river. And back in this day, the rivers were filled with kind of deadwood and dangerous hazards, but they still were way better than trying to build yourself a road. And so that was the other why. I was kind of looking at that and saying, this is our best pathway for moving things around this continent. Can we make it better? And there are a lot of layers of that. But yes, today, the thing that is most important are these locks and dams. And it started on the Ohio River in the late 19th century. They weren't constructed on the upper Mississippi actually until the 1930s, which is interesting. I'll try and come back to that. But basically, for people who don't know, the way this works, the dam is just built across the river to hold back water, right? And then you create what used to be maybe a narrow, shallow river. Because of that dam, you get this big pool, as it's called. And so that makes sure that the pool is going to be deep enough that these big towboats that need a 9-foot deep channel, that makes sure that everywhere they have that channel. And then the locks are this simple but kind of ingenious thing. Okay, if you put a bunch of dams in a river, you've turned the river into a series of a staircase of pools, and they need to get from one to another. And so the lock is just a chamber. And if you are at the top level, you close the lock and allow water to flow into it. So it reaches that level of the pool, the boat can pull in, and then you can kind of like just drain the water out. And that is like an elevator. It brings the boat down and you can open the doors and now you're on the lower level. And you can do that in reverse. You can pull in if it's at the lower level, pump water, let water flow in, that's going to carry your boat up. And so there's 27 of those on the upper Mississippi. And so that allows boats to travel up and down the length of the river all the way to St. Paul and technically into Minneapolis, but nobody really goes into Minneapolis. It is, for geological reasons, a hard thing to do. Down here on the lower
Mississippi. Can I give one shout out for that? It is the only natural waterfall on the entire Mississippi is right there in Minneapolis, right?
Yes.
You're referring to St. Anthony's?
Well, there are 2 dams before St. Anthony's Falls. Oh. So St. Anthony Falls is the only waterfall. I don't know if I'd call it natural anymore. Look, it's pretty heavily engineered itself. Right? It kind of just looks like a big dam, but it's still cool to see. I will be there actually on Wednesday. I'm excited to be there. So yeah, but it's a very narrow canyon there in Minneapolis. And that's part of why boats were like, it's hard for us to turn around in here. Why we can just unload in St. Paul. It's fine. And so there's an interesting debate about taking out some of those dams now. I'm trying to think if I've covered this all. So the why is we wanted these boats to move. An interesting thing is there was an early era of riverboat travel, right? This first steamboats appeared in the 1820s and they kind of thrived until the 1840s, 1850s, but then railroads came along and stole a lot of that traffic. And so there was a long period of time in which there was maybe some local traffic. There were maybe like vessels leaving big cities with bands playing and people having a good time, but people weren't moving cargo on the Mississippi River. And that it was in this period when there weren't boats on the Mississippi River that a lot of the construction began to happen on the Ohio River in particular. And we want traffic to be here. We want to have something that can compete against the railroads. This was after the Civil War, and people said, we just want to be a mighty nation, and the waterways helped us before, let's do it again. And so, 1933, when all these things were built on the upper Mississippi is sort of the second era and a renaissance. All this construction eventually did pay off. And so by the time that was being built on the upper Mississippi, there was a lot of traffic. And so in terms of how well it's worked, I mean, again, there's millions of dollars of cargo being moved out there. It's creating tons of jobs. Farmers across the Midwest depend on this. This is how their grain gets moved down to New Orleans and then down from there to other places across the world that they want to sell grain to. It's the existence of this waterway system made America into what it is. It's like in that first period of the early 1800s, that's how we became an economic superpower. Is we built this system that allowed these frontiers to be connected so well. I think today there's a lot of questions. Like one of them is the navigation people say it could work better. If we made these locks bigger, we would be able to move through faster. We could move more stuff. And then you have other people that say, well, actually, by turning this river into a set of pools, you really hurt the fish. You really hurt, we're causing flooding of these forests. The whole ecosystem's in peril. And so that is another thing. Like it did its purpose, but it had, the subtitle of my book's The Making and Unmaking. And so we've made a river that is a staircase, but we've unmade this beautiful set of forests and marshes and wetlands along the river by building these locks and dams. And so, this is you can't really answer how it's doing because you have to decide what is the metric by which I'm going to evaluate that. And there's a lot of different ways to do so.
That's so interesting. Thank you for the water engineering lecture and history.
Yes.
I recently drove, so I live in New Jersey. I drove to Toronto, and so we stopped at the Welland Canal, which is it's a mini canal, but I saw exactly that, how a boat goes through the canal by raising the water level, etc. So it's
Yeah, it's
fascinating.
fun to watch. If you,
Yes,
and most of the locks, to Jessica's point, they often have a viewing deck. So it is a fun thing if you're
it
driving down
does.
the
Yeah,
Mississippi to
yeah,
come and watch it. Yeah.
that's right. Businesses still benefit from all of that work. In your book, you note that about 134 billion worth of cargo was shipped in the US's inland rivers in 2019. Who pays to maintain those locks and dams and other river maintenance work that allows this cargo to be shipped?
So two groups. One group is the people using, right? They do pay a tax. I believe it's on sort of per mile or per fuel amount. And that is earmarked, right? They pay that to the federal government, and the federal government has to use that to build stuff out there. But that is a small amount. It used to be that they had to cover, I think, half the cost of new construction. There was a really big project on the Ohio River last decade, basically. It got way more expensive than expected. All of a sudden, that money wasn't working. And so Congress actually said, well, they only have to pay 35% now. And so then all of us, all Americans, cover the rest of that. And so we are paying for 65% of the construction of river engineering, and then also all of the maintenance and upkeep. And so this is an older estimate, but there's no reason why it wouldn't still stand. Some people have looked and said, all told, the American taxpayers are covering 90% of the cost of the system, right? And so that is one of the questions when you talk about how well is it working. A lot of critics will say, well, it works really well for someone who owns 10,000 acres of soybean farms and gets to save a lot of money getting their soybeans out to another country. But the rest of America is 90% paying, sort of helping subsidize that savings for him. And there's real questions of do his savings trickle out to the rest of us in any way? The agricultural economy is a very funny economy, right? These are tiny towns where these giant farms aren't necessarily spending a lot of dollars locally. So yeah, there's real questions of, does it make sense that all of the rest of us are footing this bill?
That whole thing, and you do spend some time talking about, yes, the farmland and who the farmland was given to, what the intent was when the farmland was given out that was created by channelizing and trying to control the Mississippi, what actually happened. And yeah, I think I have had to deal with a few big agriculture cases as part of just my general litigation experience. I came from a small family farm. So, when I think about agriculture, I think about the family farm, but I think, and you address this in your book, a lot of the farms we're talking about now are owned by hedge funds, right? I mean, freaking private equity owns everything at this point, and they're big multi-million-dollar corporations that, these are being given these handouts. So there was a whole other podcast we could do on Big Ag, but I did think that was really interesting that you called some of that out. And it does kind of tie into then, the entire time I'm reading your book, it's not focused on climate change, but I just feel like every issue in it relates to what Monika and I talk about and what people generally talk about with regard to climate change. I mean, here we are literally trying to control this massive natural force, these rivers, multiple rivers, really. We call it the Mississippi, but yes, as you point out, it's actually made up of multiple rivers. And so we're trying to control it. We're like, we can engineer our way against Mother Nature. And so your book is full of lessons learned and the challenges that we faced in dealing with the Mississippi, trying to control it. We can talk at some point maybe about, how well some of these levees and different things are holding. But I mean, did you think about any climate change analogies? Was that something that was on your mind at all as you were writing this book?
In two different ways. One is climate change is sort of directly impacting some of this, right? It's funny, when I was working on the book, we were coming out of a decade filled with floods on the Mississippi River. And actually, since I started writing, we have not had that. And so I was at an event last night on the river in Illinois, and someone, well, you better keep writing. We don't want more floods. But those floods are complicated, and they are caused by a lot of things, but potentially one of them is climate change. I think at this point it would be a minority contributor, but the way that climate change just makes our weather crazier has meant more big storms, more wet years in certain parts of the country. And so the flood problems that we've been having could be climate impacted. And actually, in the past couple of years, it's been really low water years. That is also climate related, right? Drought in certain parts of the country then means less water. And so that's becoming a big problem for the navigation industry. Some of their boats, the river's so shallow that the boats are nearly or sometimes actually running aground, as I understand it. But beyond that, I think the river, to me, the Mississippi River offers us lessons for climate change, right? I think about climate change. Another phrase that I like is climate chaos, right? Because we've gotten so wrapped up in global warming, that now old term, not used that often, but it sort of sits in our heads and we think of this as a problem of the world getting hotter. And that, of course, is the initial cause. But as the climate gets warmer, we're actually getting much colder winters and hotter summers and bigger storms. And so one way of thinking about this is just the world is getting wilder. It's weird, right? It's human caused, but the world is wilder. It's less in our control. And the Mississippi River, as we were talking about earlier, is such a chaotic thing. And so I don't think in the past 2 centuries we've been particularly thoughtful about that chaos or have paid attention to it in good ways. I think that most of the things that we've built in these American years, we kind of have to keep slapping band-aids on them and accumulating engineering on engineering because we always are thinking too short term. But I note in the book at length the fact that people have lived on the river for at least 12,000 years, right? And that the Mississippi River, especially down here in the South, the big lower river, was sacred to indigenous people because it was seen, despite its chaos, as being a life-giving force. And so I think really looking beyond what we've done lately and thinking on that long term about how did people survive along this river and not only survive, but come to see it as a sacred, holy place, that might have some lessons for what it's going to look like to live in a more chaotic world more generally.
And following up on that trend of lessons, one obvious comparison that jumps out to us from the book is the haves and the have-nots. How the government would come in, control the Mississippi, and somehow the rich and powerful would end up with the good land and the benefits associated with that, while the poor and often people of color would suffer. Are there any lessons that you think we can take from that history to do better as we deal with climate change and how mitigation measures and adaptation measures affects folks differently?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's a lesson as much as like an admonition, but let's stop doing that. It's not very good or fair. I don't know how much more I can say on it, except for, yeah, if you really look at what happened on the Mississippi River, which I think is an encapsulation of what happens everywhere, is again and again, right? The wealthiest people have the loudest voice, have the most access to Congress to help dictate what gets shaped, so they benefit. And so there's a reason why the Mississippi Delta, where I used to live, it was the Cotton Kingdom. It was once seen as this frontier. Everyone was going there because the farmland was so rich. It's now the poorest place in the country. And so there's an inordinate amount of wealth there held by these large farmers, but they also have incredible poverty. And I think it's not an easy thing policy-wise or politically-wise, but I think at some point we have to say, well, it's just not appropriate. We've got to do better and make sure that when we're building things, when we're distributing resources, we think about getting them to everyone.
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said about just admitting that a mistake was made and that something we thought was good was not good. And then admit the mistake, go on. But then we go into egos and, so anyway,
and I think some of it might be like getting comfortable with nuance, right? Like rather than saying thinking something we thought was good was not good. Or like it was good. Like that's been the hard part about this project. It's like going into places, and I always want to be able to talk to anyone with different points of view. And so it's important to me to acknowledge what we did engineering the Mississippi River had benefits that we all benefit. This country wouldn't be what it is if not for this. And like this country has done a lot of things wrong, but I live a pretty good life. And so it's like thinking about those carefully and saying, we've all benefited from this, but we need to pay attention to the fact that other people haven't, and that there are some mistakes and there's bad things for ecosystem, bad things for communities, and maybe, so it's not all bad, but we still need to be able to look at those mistakes.
A story that comes to mind right away is my father used to tell me when plastic bags became a thing, it was so innovative. The fact that you could carry things and if it gets wet, it doesn't break like a paper bag would. It was all well intended, but it turns out it doesn't work these days, right? It's just pollution and plastic, etc. So it's just turning the corner, right? And just making things, that worked at the time. It doesn't work anymore. Let's do something differently.
Yeah, I've written about plastic some in other settings. Like it still does, like it helps us preserve food longer. That's good. It does good things, but then it's remembering that just because it does some good things doesn't mean it's an unmitigated good that we should have more and more of, right? And like choosing what is the appropriate place for all these interventions and technologies in the world.
It is hard, but I think that is one benefit from the Mississippi is that we can learn those lessons. I think that's my hope with a lot of this is that, again, I think in some cases, for example, you highlight that Congress did intend to give out some of the new farmland that was developed as a result of the levees. It was intended to go to, maybe supposed to go to all people. Somehow it ended up as going to go to white people, but even then it didn't necessarily go to poor white people, right? It still somehow ended up being consolidated in the hands of the rich. And so trying to make sure, okay, we know we can't just say, here's this, benefit for everybody. We need to be learning these lessons. And I think the Mississippi can offer us a lot in the way of lessons. So, and speaking of like the economic disparity that you've described, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the massive federal construction company, which actually does, even though I talk about them all the time, that really crystallizes their role for me. There's another book on my wish list of books and authors to talk to, but there's a book called Charleston, Race, Water, and the Coming Storm by Susan Crawford, who talks about the experience in Charleston of trying to keep back seawaters. And then again, a lot of American history is wrapped up in Charleston. But according to her, and I would love on our wish list is to talk to somebody from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I don't know if they'll ever agree to come on the podcast. But she says in her book that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they make decisions based on an economic basis, right? Which makes sense. That's how we've all been taught. That's how things do. You have to protect the assets that have value. Why spend $500 million on a engineering project that then doesn't actually get that return on investment, right? We understand that. Of course, what that means with Charleston, what happens then is that, people in poor neighborhoods then aren't getting the protection possibly from sea level rise like people in wealthy areas are. So again, I don't know if there's anything there as far as federal policy over the years that you've seen with the Army Corps and the levees along the Mississippi, or if there's just so much farmland that kind of they just view it all as valuable.
No, there's a big controversial project in southern Mississippi called the Yazoo Pumps. And let me see if I can briefly summarize this. Basically, it's a piece of the floodplain that is now so leveed that's the problem. When rain falls, it gets trapped in those levees. And so they needed to have a way to remove it. And for 80 years, there's been a proposal on the table, let's build this pump. And it's been debated and on and off and canceled for all these reasons. Lately, over the past couple decades, particularly opposed by environmentalists saying, but actually, there's beautiful and important wetlands right there that would be damaged by this. And it was an encapsulation of something I saw again and again in these sort of economic studies is numbers are a really useful tool. It's kind of what I was just saying. They're another tool that can be used well, but we also have to pay attention to how we're using them, how other people are using them, right? Because whenever you see a statistic, it tends to be a proxy for some other idea that isn't fully quantifiable, but we're going to try and contain it in one number. And so when you're saying like this project saves X dollars or like protects X number of homes, there's just always a lot more behind that. And so without getting the weeds on the Yazoo Pumps project, it's sort of been cast as like a project that's going to help poor people that are suffering flooding because of all these levees. But then you could look at it another way and you see that it is a project that is going to essentially give millions of dollars in flood protections to not small homeowners, but large landowners who were going to be able to grow more soybeans there. A simple way of thinking about this is just, if you're to look at a flood control project in terms of how much money it saves, if one guy has a $2 million house that he goes to for 2 months of the year and it's going to get devastated in a flood, that's $2 million. If you have a community of people who live in trailers that are worth $20,000 and I'm not going to be able to do the math quickly, but there could be a whole lot of those people before you add up to that $2 million. But if that flood comes, that is 2 months out of one guy's life versus the lives of a whole community of people. And if you're just going on cost benefit analysis, those are not just equal, but actually the wealthy vacation home is more valuable and more worth saving. And so just property value is a proxy for something more. And I think what we really should be caring about are people's lives. So.
Oh, that's a good analogy. Thanks.
Yeah.
You've talked about the fact that we are spending a lot of money maintaining the levee system or the entire channelization system. Are there particular challenges or issues that keep coming up there that either one, we just keep slapping the Band-Aid on, or that are getting worse after, basically about 100 years of really a full-fledged channelization effort?
Yeah, I mean, flooding keeps getting worse, right? That's so much of what we built to stop flooding, and we keep seeing more and more of it. And again, now speak more with caution. We haven't had a bad flood year since I started working on this book. And so maybe the models I was looking at are wrong, because models can be wrong. But the models I looked at during the book and the modelers that whose sort of process made the most sense to me suggest that in the future, we're going to see more floods again on the Mississippi River. That's what climate change is going to exacerbate what is already happening for various other reasons. And there are some kind of rough studies. They use pretty simple metrics, but these studies suggest that some of the levees down here on the lower Mississippi River within the next decade, if we get a bad flood, they're going to be overtopped. And so we have to stop and think about, okay, what do we do? Do we build even higher levees, or are there other solutions that we could propose? And it's a really hard question here because, millions of people are protected by the levees. And so it doesn't, you're right, there's a part of me that sort of part of me that loves to go sleep on these islands and go paddling for weeks at a time. It's, yeah, the dream, tear down all the levees and let's just let this go back to this beautiful landscape that I love. But again, I am 2 blocks from the Mississippi River right now. I do not want the levee that is 2 blocks from my house to be torn down. And so it is this very delicate process of thinking as a whole society, as a whole country, how are we going to slowly stop this old habit we've had of thinking we can tame and control the river. And what we have to do is let the river do what it wants to do. But we're going to have to do that slowly because we can't just snap our fingers and go back to what we used to have.
Yeah, there needs to be a transition.
Yeah.
Yeah, you say that there is an old adage. There are 2 kinds of levees, those that have failed and those that will fail. It's terrifying. Do you think there's a backup plan for when that happens?
Yeah, it is terrifying. But I think you could expand that adage to anything we built, right? It's like the work I do gets me thinking something like that could be on a geological timescale where we're not going to be here eventually. So, but to the actual question, the backup plan, I mean, no. I mean, sitting here in New Orleans and I was not here during Katrina, right? And that's a different levee system. The river levee system did not fail during Katrina. Our hurricane protection levee system failed, but there wasn't a very good backup plan. And so it's the same. I mean, the levee system, I mean, there have been levee failures on the Missouri River, on the upper Mississippi, and there is not a backup plan. There are farmers, there are whole communities in certain places that are emptying out because at this point, the levees have failed. It's too costly to fix them. The backup plan is sort of, let what happens, right? Unmanaged retreat, as we call it in the climate world, right? That's what we're looking at.
Well, you had mentioned that like the forecast, the models, and I'm assuming you're talking about climate modeling, which Monika and I have talked about on here before, is forecasting worse floods, levees also being overtopped, which I guess is technically different than maybe failing. But when you say overtopped, I'm trying to picture this. Is this like a bathtub where all of a sudden the water just starts flowing over the top and then you get some water over the top into surrounding communities? Or is it far worse than that? Or can it go a whole range?
I'm going to separate this out. I don't know that study well enough to say what they project happening here in the lower Mississippi River. I will note that generally so overtopping a levee would be the river rises so high that it's now higher than the river. And so you're going to get sort of water flowing. And the levee, for people that don't know, it's kind of like an earthen wall. If you do a cross section, it's kind of mound shaped, but it's a very long linear mound. And so overtopping the water is just going to be kind of flowing over the top and flowing down. But the problem there is that's going to cause erosion and scour. And so that the fact of overtopping could, in certain scenarios, lead to levee failure because it's going to sort of carve a little hole at the top and carve more and more until all of a sudden it busts through. And then you get sort of the really massive damage of lots of water flowing quickly. So that could happen. But again, I don't know if that's what these studies talk about. They were just kind of, I think like I said, they were pretty rough studies, but they were kind of looking at, let's take the climate models and what that shows about how much water might be flowing into the Mississippi River and pair those with models of like how does that translate to river stages, and then showing that the river stages are not far from being higher than the height of the levees.
So you live in New Orleans. It's hard to talk about the Mississippi without talking of New Orleans and vice versa. But one of the issues that you address in the books is the chance that the Mississippi may not always flow through New Orleans. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is one of, like, when I'm talking about all the things we've done in the Mississippi River, this is one of the wilder ones. So the landscape down here in Louisiana, I think people can picture, right, this big grassy, marshy area. And the way almost all of the Louisiana coastline was built was by the Mississippi River flowing down and just like dumping out mud. And the reason why it is 100-mile wide coast is because the Mississippi River has moved through the years, kind of related to what we were talking about at the beginning. It would be flowing down one route, but it might kind of have a little exit over here and a little exit over here. And as it's building so much mud down one path, eventually that becomes inefficient. And it realizes, hey, that other little exit I have up there, that's shorter. Why don't I just start sending the water that way? So every 1,000 or years or so, it would make pretty big jumps, dozens to hundreds of miles apart where the mouth of the river might be. And in the 1940s, engineers and scientists took a look at this river called the Atchafalaya River that emerges from the Mississippi in northern Louisiana. So it's one last big distributary, it's called. And they realized it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're like, it looks like it's about to do that. The river is going to shift, and all of a sudden, that's going to be the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River is going to be the Little River. And so we built something called the Old River Control Structure, which is really actually sort of like a whole campus of different gates and levees and all this stuff. And basically, the idea there is to maintain the flow of water as it existed in 1950 and make sure that 70% of the water is in the Mississippi, 30% of the water is in the Atchafalaya, not a different arrangement than that. Which is just to say, like, the thing that makes it hit most for me is basically we've frozen geological time. And so it will forever be 1950 on the Mississippi River. It's no longer going to get to change the way it wants to.
It's crazy that we're stuck in 1950. And you alluded to that at the beginning of the conversation. Nature's fluid, right? Water is fluid. Like, it's supposed to evolve and change, and we are modifying it. And I think we may be seeing the consequences of modifying nature.
Yeah. That system also is working. It's not about to fail by any means, but like more models, they're looking and saying, actually, despite this, the Atchafalaya continues to be a better and better channel. So if something catastrophic happened to these gates, that like it's still set up to do this. And so if we keep having presidents that don't want to fund federal work, we're going to keep this thing up. What happens here,
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, because I found that to be one of the most striking parts of the book. So the distributaries are the opposite of a tributary. I never really thought about that. I always picture a river, whole bunch of little rivers come together, make one big river. That river then goes dumps into the ocean somewhere. But yeah, here's actually where it's a separate river that starts at the Mississippi and then branches off on its own to the Gulf of Mexico, right? So that's what the distributary is.
Yeah, and you can picture like a tree, right? A tree has roots and then a trunk and then branches. And the river does the same way. Kind of the branches come down into one main trunk that is the Mississippi, the core of Mississippi, and then down in Louisiana, it starts to split into these many roots.
And again, we talk a lot about New Orleans on here. We had a guest on, I think that was our first season. She talked about the many challenges that New Orleans has. It is a fabulous town. Everybody who goes there loves it, including me, unless it's in the summer because I don't like the heat. But, it's this fabulous river. And of course, most of our focus is on like hurricanes like Katrina, the seawater thing. But the fact that it actually has this whole other vulnerability that I had not even become aware of until, you raised it in your book. I was like, oh my gosh, that'd be pretty ironic if we're all worried about the ocean water coming in. And then all of a sudden New Orleans is jeopardized because it actually loses basically the Mississippi, which I think, again, certainly from an economic standpoint, is still very important to New Orleans, right?
Yeah, more than that, it's our drinking water. Our drinking water would be gone. We get it out of the Mississippi River. But yeah, the big thing is, again, I keep talking about my house here. At night, I can hear the freighters that come into the port that is right behind my house. That is a huge economic engine. So much of farmland goods in the Midwest depend on this port. And so if the river shifted, this just wouldn't be a viable port anymore. And so we'd have to build a whole new port city over in this tiny town called Morgan City, and New Orleans would become the Morgan City over here, just like a little backwater town, which would be a weird change after 4 centuries.
Another fact that my kids are sick and tired of me telling them from the book is the fact that New Orleans is actually built on land that's really the newest land in the entire, I guess, continent or contiguous U.S. It's really only like that land there is only about 4,000 years old, right?
Yeah, it's weird that one of our oldest cities is on some of our newest land, which reminds us of how new America is generally, right?
That and really how vulnerable it is because it was basically land that was built thanks to the Mississippi Delta and that mud, as you discussed before. So yeah, I just find that fascinating. New Orleans is just so amazing, and obviously there would be a lot of challenges if something were to happen with Mississippi and New Orleans. And speaking of New Orleans, you included a quote in the book from the Chief of Public Affairs for the Army Corps there. And I just want to read this quote because I think, again, it ties in so much to just the challenges we're taking on with climate change. So the Chief of Public Affairs said, "I always say we've picked the worst enemy in the world, and that's Mother Nature. Because at the end of the day, we know that Mother Nature can do what Mother Nature wants, and we're just trying to hold it on pause." So I thought that was a great quote. Like you said, I mean, we're trying to pause parts of the Mississippi where it was in 1950. We're trying to pause other parts of it where it was in the 30s. And again, obviously, I think about that every single day as we talk about climate change. I'm like, the climate chaos doesn't care what we think or what we do. It's going to do whatever. The goal is just for us to find ways to adapt with and live and hopefully still thrive in this changing climate. As we wrap up here, is there anything positive you think that we can take from your book and your kind of education on the Mississippi River as we look at climate change?
Oh, such a good question. I mean, I'm going to go back to that quote for a minute and say, right, I think there's 2 things that strike me in it. One is hold the river on pause, which underlines that what we've been talking about. We've frozen these rivers. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people, and it should be. And we should be struck by the fact that what we're trying to do is pause the river. But the other thing that I want to call attention to, I think maybe wouldn't catch people so much, and is the word enemy, right? He's talking about the river as our enemy. And that's crazy, but I think we're accustomed to that. We're accustomed to the idea of a flood fight, and that's been totally normalized. And I say all that because that gets to like the hope that I think maybe we could draw from this book. I mean, I remember some of the Amazon reviews, I try not to read them, but they're funny. And people are like, it's so depressing and this and that. But this book is a book about love too. It's grew out of my love for the Mississippi River. And this is maybe subtextual in the book, implicit in the book. I don't have solutions in there. And when I give talks, people say, what should we do? And I'm like, I don't know policy wise. That's not what I do. But the solution I have is maybe has to do with my own experience of writing this book, is because I fell in love with the Mississippi River and went and found what's beautiful amid the most engineered waterway on this planet, one of the most engineered waterways on this planet, right? I found this thing that is completely broken and tarnished and remains so wild feeling and gorgeous. And that has helped me think about the river as not being an enemy. That's helped me think about the river being alive. That's an idea that's going to be coming up more and more. I think there's a great new book called Are Rivers Alive? And that's an easy question for me to answer after spending 10 years studying and paddling and exploring the Mississippi River. And I think that is part of the solution for all of these issues, is thinking about nature not as something conquerable or enumerable, that nature is alive and nature is, we can study it and we should study it, but those studies are always going to fall short of what is actually there. And there has to be some sense of love and reverence and sacredness in this. And so that would be the hope I would have. It would be like, I hope people read this book and fall in love with the Mississippi, or fall in love with something, their home waters, whatever water basin you're in, or even your ecosystem, anything like that. But I hope you can be inspired less just by the facts in this book and the process. So go understand the place you all fall in love with it. And that's the first step towards reorienting the philosophies behind our policy so we can get better policies.
That's great. It's hard to follow up to that, but I have one. I was just in Florida and I went snorkeling in the Florida coral reef. And it's hard not to fall in love with nature and water and ocean when you see so much beauty that is just there, right? Untouched. And it worries me that we have affected nature so much, and affected species of animals and fish, etc. But it's definitely, I don't find it hard to fall in love with nature. That's for sure.
Right.
Just to finish up our episode, were there any issues or topics that you wanted to include in the book, but you didn't because of space or whatever reason?
Yeah, there's actually a lot. I mean, the third section of the book is the modern section and me exploring everything that's gone wrong. And that used at first draft, that was twice as long and I had to cut out half of it. So there was a lot of Minneapolis in the book, for example, and it's a tiny discussion now, but this debate over whether or not to pull out the locks and dams, that was much bigger. Can't even remember the others, but yeah, it's sort of endless stories and endless fights that you can look at on the Mississippi River because of how much has been done to it.
That brings up another good point, because my son actually wanted me to ask you, and you may know this. He's a fisherman, and nobody knows water laws like fishermen, who have to argue with, I don't know, game wardens, property owners, whatever. My son's always willing to argue. But about the fact that at least some of the places in Minnesota, he knows parts of Mississippi are controlled by like the federal government, federal laws, and some are state, because apparently that impacts when he can fish. But another issue that the Mississippi River brings up that we didn't get to touch on is it also the challenges we face with climate change are similar to the challenges we face with the Mississippi River, whereas actually a whole bunch of states, we draw all these arbitrary boundaries. Here's the state of Wisconsin. Sometimes, ironically, they actually follow along river, lines that is actually used, but otherwise we draw these arbitrary lines and say, all right, Wisconsin, you're responsible for this land on this side of the river. Minnesota, you're responsible on this side. And then obviously you have the federal government over all of it. And I think about that with climate change too. We're actually dealing up here in the upper Midwest, we're dealing again with smoke from the Canadian wildfires. So in that case, it's even across international boundaries. But I think the Mississippi, like many of the climate change challenges that we focus on today, actually do require efforts not just from New Orleans or Louisiana, or even really the United States. I mean, these are all massive, big challenges and issues where we all can benefit from a lot of these, natural things. Again, you point out, there's been so many benefits we've gotten from the Mississippi River over the years, but also the downside can hurt people from so many different places. So the other challenge too always is, how do we get all these various governments to hopefully work together in a productive and forward manner to actually address these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the lessons of river, this goes back to like the story of the river being the story of the floodplain. Another way to think about it is like, to understand rivers, you have to understand how radically interconnected they are, right? To their floodplain, to other rivers. I was, again, up in a small town in Illinois yesterday, overlooking the Mississippi River, and we got really heavy rain, and all of a sudden this sort of ditch that was going by the cottage where I was staying became this giant torrent. And I was like, and then it's filled with mud that I knew was running off farm fields at the top of its bluff. And This is going to be the case with anything with climate, but I think rivers are tangible and familiar to us, and they can remind us of, yeah, they flow through different states, and that Wisconsin is in charge of local wastewater discharge, but the Army Corps is in charge of navigation, but everything is this way. Everything is this sort of assemblage of different scales and different things interacting. So
thank you so much. Again, we could talk much longer. There are so many parts of the book that I've highlighted that we did not touch on, but this was really fascinating. Monika, I don't know, I have obviously a very strong emotional connection to the Mississippi too. So I don't know, hopefully you found this conversation good too. Have you ever been on the Mississippi, Monika?
I have been, yes, because I have visited New Orleans. I have been on a tourist boat over the Mississippi River, but I do have a connection with nature. You know, I'm originally from Venezuela, where the largest waterfalls in the world are, Angel Falls. And I remember visiting it as a child, and I had a moment. It has been the most beautiful thing I have seen in the world. And realizing how powerful nature is, you know, when you just stand there and you're just so tiny next to this, you know, the Angel Falls are about, I think, are 10 or 11 times as high as the Niagara Falls.
Wow.
So it's just this massive thing. It's just, you know, it's hard to explain with words. So I do have a connection with nature and how powerful it is. So I definitely relate to it.
And certainly the power is something that we're experiencing, unfortunately, in too many negative ways these days as climate chaos becomes worse. But I do think that your book, Boyce, gives a really good kind of background for certainly anyone who wants to talk about, here's how we can handle these things going forward. Let's build a wall. Let's, you know, build a levee, whatever. I think your book has a lot of lessons for. There are a lot of consequences that come out of our attempts to just engineer our way. I love engineers. Don't get me wrong. Monika knows I'm a big fan, big wannabe engineer. But we can't just engineer our way out of climate chaos because, yeah, Mother Nature is very powerful. So Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. I urge everyone to read your book. We will definitely include a link to it in our show notes, along with the Fisk maps and some of the other things we've talked about.
Thanks for listening to Adapt: Climate Change and the Built Environment. We hope you enjoyed this episode and come back to hear more of our conversations with people leading the way and addressing the issues facing the built environment as our climate changes. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and share our podcast with others who may be interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests for future seasons, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at adaptthebuiltenvironment@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.